thank you. Um, I appreciate everybody's interest in lessons from the front lines, military generals, mindfulness, and emotional intelligence. And let's see. Oh no, it's not moving, Wendy.
There, it should now. There you go. If you click in the center of the screen, it should go for you.
Let's try this again. There, no, oh, yeah, we are. All right. So throughout modern, since around World War II, where we started talking about the organization man and business started looking like it did at the end of the 20th century before the internet hit and changed everything, a lot of the business training utilized military metaphors when they were talking about business leadership. And there were very good reasons for it. One of my favorite is cool under fire. And I have not been in the military, and that's part of the story of how this presentation came to be. But even though I've not personally had military service, there were times when I was in charge of an IT implementation and it got a little crazy and the proverbial bullets were flying, and I really felt like I was ducking and covering. So there are a lot of, over the years, there have been lots of military metaphors used in the business world. Now, why do I keep doing that? I was, as an adjunct instructor at George Mason University, I was working with the project management PMP certification curriculum. And several years ago, when the military started downsizing and bracking, we were getting a large number of military folks in our classes because the military wanted to help them have jobs when they left the military, and they felt that their military background made them well suited for being project managers in the civilian force. And as I said, I personally don't have any military background. I can really say my best friends were military folks, but that didn't give me the authenticity to come up with some examples. So I looked for a book that would help me understand military strategy and combat wisdom, the impact of technology. And I discovered a book by Thomas Ricks, who is a well-known journalist. And this is the generals, the book itself is about the 4 great wars in the latter half of the 20th century and the generals who led them. Now, I learned a great deal about all of this information, and especially the civilian stakeholders, which made me really think about project management and when we work with matrix teams and how there are times where everybody wants to have the authority, but nobody will put their name on the piece of paper. And it was interesting to see how that worked in other places. Now, at the same time that I was reading this book about technical military history, I also saw an article by a Dr. Ellen Langer, who is a PhD in sociology at Harvard University. And she had just written an article where she looked at Harvard Business School graduates. All of those graduates come into Harvard Business School with similar GMAT scores, similar CVs, similar grade points. But when they leave, some are very, very successful and others not so. And she wanted to know if they all came in with the same credentials, if they all had the same education, how, when they left, were the results so very different? And what she had pointed it out, or what she attributed to after a 2-year study of all of these Harvard Business School alumni, was a concept of mindlessness versus mindfulness. And what she said about mindlessness versus mindfulness, and let me just quote directly, mindlessness is the application of yesterday's business solutions to today's problems. And what that means is you're taking the lessons that you learned and you're adapting them exactly to today's problems. Even though the scenario might be a little bit different, something has changed, you're just using those same lessons. You're not thinking it through, you're not adapting it. And I think about that as calling that linear thinking. Whereas mindfulness, the Harvard MBAs that were incredibly successful were mindful. And her definition of mindfulness is the attunement of today's demands to avoid tomorrow's difficulties. So the graduates who were really successful were the people that took the lessons they learned yesterday and said, okay, how have things changed today? How can I adapt that? And then moving forward, how can I make it a little bit easier for other people? How do I put in a policy that's flexible or will encourage people to ask the right questions so that we'll continue that cycle of learning? And that's that adapting and attuning to the changes in the world around us. And so as I was reading The Generals, a very technical military book, there's an adage that says, when the only tool you have is a hammer, every solution looks like a nail. And that's, so I call it reflections, because as I was reading that book, I realized that the generals that led the military efforts in that latter half from 1940, through 2000, through the 1990s, were incredibly had emotional intelligence, were very, very engaged, that they had more than just a rote, this is what we do. They really understood their environments, they were able to adapt, and they were able to recognize the potential in other people. And so this is a quote, Dan Goleman, Richard Boyatzis, and Annie McKee continue to be some of the leaders in emotional intelligence. And in their book, Primal Leadership, if you wanted to get a good, easy to read book that describes emotional intelligence and how you can apply it, I recommend Primal Leadership. And out of this book, it just spoke to these military leaders that the leader in any human group has been the one to whom others look for assurance and clarity when facing uncertainty or threat. And so whether you're in military combat or your combat is that IT installation, when things don't go right, and we can guarantee that it's not going to be smooth, you as the project manager or the project leader are the people who everybody turns to say, okay, now what do we do? And one of the reasons they turn to you is because of emotional intelligence and leadership. So before I hop back to the reflection, I'd like to just take a moment and give you a quick crash course in emotional intelligence. When Daniel Goleman first put out his book in the 90s, I was working in telecommunications, and I was designing fiber optic systems. At one point, I could even cut down a 10-base T fiber. I was very technical. And in the 1990s, feelings were not appropriate in the workplace. We didn't talk about